To our weekly Zoom news conference. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, we're focusing on student debt, which now totals $1.7 trillion, held by 43 million student borrowers. Fear of going into student debt has helped trigger a dramatic decline in student enrollment in all but the country's Ivy League colleges. This is only one of the consequences of student debt. Our speakers today include policymaker, expert, advocate, and students themselves. We're honored to be joined by Representative Khanna, U.S. Congressman for California's 17th District, Kat Welbeck, Civil Rights Counsel for the Student Borrower Protection Center, Joe Jaramillo, Senior Attorney at Housing and Economic Rights Advocates, and Andrea Campo and Gabe Stewart, two students struggling to stay afloat with student loans. We'll send extended bios and contact information together with a video of the conference to all participants this afternoon. We ask reporters to enter questions in the chat box so our moderator can select questions for each speaker after their presentation. We'll have a final round, we hope, of Q&As at the end of the hour. Thanks to the Blue Shield of California Foundation for its support of these briefings, to Oscar Arteta and Jackie No, who provide simultaneous interpreting in Spanish and Korean, and to our conference coordinators, Pilar Marrero, Sunita Sarabji, Tanu Henry, and Anthony Advincula. A special thanks today to Maeva Elise Brown, Director of Housing and Economic Rights Advocates, for helping us plan the conference. So turning the conference over to today's moderator, Pilar Marrero. Pilar, it's all yours.
Thank you, Sandy. Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. This is a hot topic, as you all know, right now. There's a lot of discussion around what it is the potential solution for this issue. So we'll go straight to our first speaker, who has been very active on this, and that is a representative of Congressman Khanna. He represents the 17th District of California. Representative Khanna, thank you for being with us, and the stage is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Pilar, and thank you to Sunita for inviting me. I want to address, of course, the student loan issue, but just wanted to comment briefly on the COVID relief bill that passed. I'm very supportive of many parts of that bill, including aid to state and local governments for vaccination, school aid, to funding for child tax credits, tax credits for families, and an increase in the earned income tax credit and monthly checks and unemployment insurance. But I'm very disappointed that the $15 minimum wage isn't in there. And it was a core issue for so many Americans, and we're going to continue the push to really raise the minimum wage from $7.25. In that context, the student loan issue is also a huge a problem. I mean, you have basically a generation saddled with that debt. I personally had to take out over $100,000 of loans for graduate school education. Now, I was able to pay them off in my late 30s because of unique circumstances, and I was fortunate and have done well, and am in a position to pay them off. And certainly student loans shouldn't be forgiven for people like me who are in a position to pay them off. But for the vast majority of Americans, especially Americans who are making under $125,000 a year.
Congressman, we need you to slow down a little bit for the interpreters. Thank you.
Yeah, especially Americans who are making less than $125,000 a year. We need to forgive those loans, and we have the capacity to forgive those loans. the president has the power, of executive power, to say that debt student loans can be forgiven. How do we know this? Because the president has already exercised the power to delay student loans. So if you can delay loans and you can say that people don't have to pay them back for a while, why it's the same authority that gives you the power to forgive those loans. It would cost a little over $1 trillion, and that we can pay for actually by the Stop Cheaters Act, which is my bill, that would just collect over $1.2 trillion, according to Larry Summers, by enforcing the law, by enforcing the law on the top 1%. If we forgive the student loan, people will be able to start families, buy houses, start businesses. It's really lifting the burdens on this next generation from pursuing their dreams. So progressives are going to continue to push for the administration to do this. That is the way to get it through, especially if we don't eliminate the filibuster. And I'm open to questions. I see one question about, is it fair to people like me? I do think it's fair, because the reality is those of us who've been able to pay them off have been fortunate, and that doesn't mean that we can't be empathetic to others who haven't had the same fortune. Now, I understand that there's some parents who say, well, look, I worked so hard, scraped by, so my kids could pay this off. And I say that that's such a amazing example, and the discipline that you and love that you've shown your children is something that will stand them well in their life, and they should be applauded. But that doesn't mean that we burden other kids who didn't have the same amazing parents, and burden them in such a way that they are not able to pursue their dreams.
Thank you so much, Congressman. We have a question here from Peter White. Peter, do you want to ask your question? Can you unmute Peter? Peter White.
Hi, Congressman. Thank you for being here. I was just wondering if you have any things to tell us that you might know about the president's thinking about it. He's been pretty sort of like, no, I'm not going to do that lately. At least that's what I heard. Forgive student debt.
He said no to 50,000 and yes to 10,000 and lowering the cost of college. But Congressman?
So the 10,000 at least would be a start. The challenge is that we have to have the president take that action. The 60 votes simply aren't there to get over a filibuster. And I believe that the more the president hears from the grassroots community, and more he hears about the importance of the minimum wage increase, the importance of student debt forgiveness, the more likely there will be action from the White House. The COVID relief bill is very important, and I'm proud to have voted for it, will vote for it again, the Senate version. But it's not making enough of the structural change that's necessary. And we need to have student debt forgiveness and an increase in wages to make that structural change.
Sunita, you have a question.
Yes, I do. Congressman Khanna, we have programs in place such as Teach for America, and a program that allows med students who work at federally qualified health centers to have a portion of their student debt forgiven. Is it a question of simply expanding those types of programs so that more students can have their loans forgiven if they participate in programs that serve the community?
Well, I'm not opposed to having some community service part to having student loans forgiven. I'd be open to that. And if the president said, look, he's forgiving 50,000 of loans or even 10,000 of loans that is going to have some community service component to it, I could get behind that. I don't think it's necessary, but I can see the argument why some may say, let's have some community work. And if that's what it will take, I could get behind such a effort.
Thank you.
There's a question from Manny Otico. Manny, can you unmute Manny Otico?
Yeah, my question is that I read something online that said that the student debt problem got really bad after some actions was taken in the early 80s when I believe Bill Bennett was their Secretary of Education. Can you know when did they start getting out of control, get to $1 trillion? You know, was there a point where it was pinpointed to?
And we will talk about that later too.
When did the student debt get this high?
Mhm.
In what year?
Yeah, when did it start getting out of control? Because there's a point, according to things I've heard, there's a point when going to state college was relatively inexpensive. And all of a sudden, it started getting like really expensive, and people have to
No,
borrow
it's a
money.
great question. I
Yeah.
don't know the exact. I mean, I don't know. California was virtually free till
Yes.
till Reagan, I think, came in and cut a lot of the state higher education budgets, and until we had Prop 13, which made it much harder to get the funding for higher education. So I know that was the turning point in California. Nationally, I don't know the statistics well enough when the turning point happened that the cost started to skyrocket. I would guess it was sometime in the 80s, but it's certainly worth looking at.
I think Adonis Tagala should ask his question. I think it's very relevant right now. Adonis Tagala?
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, because tuition fees are so expensive nowadays. Why can't just lawmakers make them much lower or much affordable instead?
Well, we are. That's what Bernie Sanders ran on, and we're on that bill to have free public college linked to tuition not rising beyond a certain percent on inflation. It's about a $700 billion expense, and we should do that. But that's for public college, and there's still people who may not go to the public colleges, and there's still a lot who are saddled with loans. So we need some version of both.
Oni, do you want to ask your question? Oni Advincula.
Thank you, Pilar. Congressman, forgiveness of student loans would definitely provide an enormous relief. But these loans that we're talking about are mainly federal. But a big percentage of student loans, including myself that I've taken, were from private banks, especially if you go to an Ivy League school, and that's basically encouraged to do it with private banks. What's the plan on this? And for the future, so we don't have to have this vicious cycle, what is the plan on this also on the policy side?
Well, I appreciate that. The plan, as I understand Warren and Schumer's proposal, is that it includes loans for private institutions. So it's not just for public institutions, and it would include loans from private banks. At least Sanders' proposal does. But I think we want to be drawing this proposal broadly, as long as people are under a certain income level, 125,000, to include all sorts of loans that they may have taken on that is burdening their ability to start a family or have a house or start a business.
And I also understand that people who have loans with private banks did not get a break during the pandemic. So they did not get the same thing that others got. So they continue to pay.
Yeah,
right?
no, which is very challenging. Yeah, because the assumption is that just because you went to a private university and have private loans doesn't mean that you're working at Google and fine. I mean, there's a lot of people who are still struggling. And so I think the criteria should be not whether you went to public or private university. The criteria should be what is your income level? And if you've done well and you've been fortunate, then you should pay back. But if you're still struggling, then there should be forgiveness.
Last question for the Congressman. Fatma, ask your question. Fatma Baki. Can you unmute her? Fatma Baki.
Yeah. Hi, how are you? My question is, what do you think are the main reasons that students are not enrolling in higher education?
Enrollment has dropped, yes.
This year, or has it been dropping for a while?
It has been dropping for a while, but especially this year.
Well, this year, I'm sure the pandemic had to do with it, but I think overall the costs have a lot to do with it. I mean, the fact is that the cost of higher education has continued to skyrocket. It's not affordable for a lot of people. And then there has to be a greater link between education and the job market. And not every college degree is leading to a job, and certain times credentialing may be better opportunities for jobs. So we want to have the key is to have tertiary education, whether it's a four-year college or community college or credentialing, be linked to concrete jobs and be affordable for every American.
Congressman, thank you so much for being
Thank
with
you.
us. We really appreciate it.
Always
As
enjoy it.
always.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to go to our next speaker, and Catherine Welbeck, Civil Rights Counsel for the Student Borrower Protection Center, which is an organization based in Washington, if I'm not mistaken. Kat, the stage is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, good afternoon, everyone. I really just want to start by thanking Pilar. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join today's call. So many wonderful and esteemed speakers. I'm just really honored to be in front of everyone today to talk a little bit about the student debt crisis. As Pilar said, my name is Kat Welbeck, Civil Rights Counsel at the Student Borrower Protection Center, and just a little bit of background on who we are. We're a national nonprofit organization based in DC, and we're solely focused on alleviating the burden of student debt in this country. So we engage in a mix of advocacy, policy making, and litigation strategy to rein in industry abuses, protect borrowers.
Remember to think about the interpreters, Kat.
Oh, sorry, I will slow down. My apologies.
Yes.
And advance economic opportunity for all student loan borrowers. So in my role, I mostly work to examine the student debt crisis through a lens of racial equity and economic justice. And so I'm, again, really excited to talk to you all today. And so what I'm going to do primarily is give a little bit of background about where we are on the student debt crisis, and especially some of the racial disparities that we're seeing in this crisis. So to start, this is something that Sandy mentioned at the outset. We have 45 million borrowers who owe a collective $1.7 trillion in student loan debt in this country. And so that actually makes student loans the second largest class of consumer debt in this country. And so it's only second to mortgages. And so what we see is with this much outstanding debt, the ripple effects of this crisis are really stretching across our communities and across our economy. And what's so interesting now is, especially as we're grappling right now with the economic crisis, before millions of families have even recovered from the last one in the coming out of the Great Recession, student debt really threatens to exacerbate a lot of the ongoing economic fallout that we're seeing in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, we tell students that education is a tool for social mobility, and we really encourage, students to get degrees. But what we've seen time and time again is that the crisis of student debt is really hampering economic opportunity for millions of student loan borrowers. And so it was almost like that student debt is casting a shadow over our communities. And so one thing I really want to talk about today is really thinking about, when we're having this conversation about student debt, is really thinking about how it fuels economic, gender, and racial inequality. And it really inhibits asset accumulation. It accelerates wealth gaps, and it's really carving out this divide. And so if we're going to talk about creating a more equitable and just economy, we can't, overlook the disparate effects of the student debt crisis and how it continues to perpetuate many systemic barriers that already exist in this country. And so one thing I'd like to start with is really talking about how the student debt crisis is really interwoven into many of these barriers. And so I like to start talking about the racial wealth gap because it helps paint this broader picture. And so what we see a lot of times, especially with Black and Latino borrowers, is that with this racial wealth gap, they have less household wealth. And then are taking on more loans to pay for school, and so in turn leave school with more debt, and then that cuts into opportunities for wealth creation over time. And so then what happens when it's time for their children to go to college, that there's potential for that cycle to repeat. And so what I kind of want to do is break that down and what those numbers look like a little bit, just to dive in there. So again, like I said, to start, because like the racial wealth gap, we often see that Black and Latino students borrow more money to go to college. So approximately 90% of Black students and 72% of Latino students take on debt to pay for college, in comparison to about 66% of white students.
Kat, do you want to share your slides or?
I meant to make a note about that. I'm happy just to speak through these items, but Pilar has a set of slides that have some of this information in them. And then also
we can just give it to them later.
Yeah. Okay, and perfect.
Okay,
and I'm
cool.
also, and if there are any questions after, I'm, I know there's a set amount of time, but after, I'm happy to answer questions, there's an email.
You won't have time for questions.
Okay, perfect. And so because, like, as I was saying, that Black and Latino students are less likely to draw on familial wealth to pay for college, that can result in more debt. And so, but in addition to that, we also—
Slower, please.
we also see additionally hardships in repayment. So for example, 20 years after starting college, the typical Black borrower still owes about 95% of their original student loan balance, while the median white borrower was paid almost 95% of their balance at the same time. And then in a similar vein, we've seen research that the typical Latino borrower still owes 83% of their initial balance, compared to the median white borrower who's paid down nearly half of their balance about 12 years after starting college. And then we also see, in addition to disparities in, who's repaying over time, is that we also see their higher levels, also higher levels of default and delinquency in with Black and Latino borrowers. And so this becomes especially concerning because there are really severe consequences that come with default. And so earlier I was talking about, taking on more debt, higher balances, taking longer to pay off debt has economic consequences. It can affect borrowers' ability to buy homes, to start businesses, to save for retirement, and how that, cuts into opportunities for wealth building. But what we also see when we see that borrowers also have higher levels of default are concentrated in some communities, that's also really concerning because default comes with many, many penalties. And so not only with negative credit reporting, borrowers may struggle to find a job because, again, that's reported on a credit report. It can cause trouble, difficulty renting a home, or even in some places, there have been laws where borrowers who had loans in default could have the professional's license revoked, which is really crazy when you think about it, that someone's struggling to pay off their loans and could potentially have professional license that means their livelihood revoked for not paying. But really, there are a lot of really—
Remember to speak slower.
I'm sorry.
Your brain is fast.
But yeah, so there are many negative consequences that come with default. In addition to that, borrowers can have, wages garnished, tax refunds withheld, and social security benefits offset. And so when we're really thinking about, these racial disparities, there are some really alarming consequences that can come with this level of student debt, and also seeing really broad variances in how borrowers are performing with their loans. And so, if we're thinking about how to address racial and economic injustice head on, I think we really have to think about ways that we're protecting student loan borrowers, that we're thinking about the student debt crisis, and especially with these racial disparities in mind. And just really thinking of this both as a civil rights crisis and also a consumer protection crisis. And so I know I'm running a little bit close to time, but one thing is also, aside from thinking about ballooning balances and monthly bills, again, I was saying this is also a consumer protection crisis where we do see a lot of predatory, institutions actually build entire business models based on targeting, communities of color, many times Black and Latino communities, just to bolster the bottom lines that we've seen, private student loan companies routinely target some borrowers with really high costs and high risk products that lead borrowers to struggle. We've seen that student loan debt collectors, sometimes single out certain communities with illegal and predatory collection tactics. And then we've also even seen, for example, for-profit schools engage in reverse redlining tactics where they're really exploiting communities and driving this crisis and really putting borrowers in further distress. And so, there's also really a role here for, state, federal, and local regulators to step in and also make sure that they're protecting borrowers. And I'll stop there. I think I'm close to my time.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And we do have questions. Julia Dudley, you have a question? Can you please ask it if you get unmuted now?
Yes, hi. Thank you. And thank you, Kat, I look forward to the presentation. The bigger part of my question deals with the aftermath, because we find that a lot of students aren't able to get those prestigious internships because they can't work an unpaid internship. And at the same time, they can't get hired in the jobs that they would normally be able to do if they had the experience. It's like a catch-22. And so I see a lot of even some of my former students when I used to teach 10 years ago, still struggling in the same job and not able to bypass. Is there any data to support that part of the economic, trickling of the economic effect that is affecting specifically Black and Brown students who right out of college or right out of school, they don't have that fallback for the profession they would like to go into? Is there any data supporting that? Thank you.
Well, actually, that's an awesome question. I don't have that specific data, but one thing that we like to point to, and it's something I maybe didn't go into as much detail in what I was presenting, but when we're talking about those systemic disparities, you're right. Like, so when I say the racial wealth gap, that's so many different things, right? That's the wage gap, right? We know, like, you know, women and people of color tend to make less money on the dollar. We know that there's employment discrimination, right? There are all these things that can go into the world, that can go into these things. Are also what you just pointed out, who can afford to have an unpaid internship, right? Like, even if it's not like discrimination, just understanding that like not everyone can afford to take an unpaid internship that's going to propel their career, right? And so I think these are really great questions to think about, how all of these things really play into this broader picture of, you know, how different borrowers are performing in this, you know, are having different outcomes in this crisis. And I think, you know, so we're having this broader conversation, and I know many people had a lot of really great questions just before about debt cancellation or talking about college affordability. And so understanding that when we're talking about, you know, debt cancellation, we're talking about college affordability, we're also talking about how, you know, that also helps narrow these racial wealth gaps that we're talking about. We're narrowing these disparities because we also, like, to the point you're bringing, we know who might be less likely to take an unpaid internship, who might be more inclined to face wage discrimination or employment discrimination. So thinking about all those things when we factor that in. So I really appreciate that question.
Thank you, Kat. We have more questions, but we need to go to the next speaker. If you can stay around for a little bit, maybe we can come back to you with a couple more questions at the end, okay? If you have time. Thank you. Okay, and now we're going to go to Joe Jaramillo. He's the senior attorney at Housing and Economic Rights Advocates. Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you, Pilar, and thank you, Sandy, for bringing us together. My name is Joe Jaramillo. I'm a senior attorney at Housing and Economic Rights Advocates, or HERA for short. HERA is a nonprofit legal services organization based in Oakland, dedicated to assisting low to moderate income consumers in California on their debt and credit problems, including student loan debt. HERA has assisted hundreds of borrowers in California with managing student loan repayment and applying for relevant loan discharge and forgiveness options, particularly helping students from the for-profit schools. And I want to thank Kat Welbeck for her excellent presentation, because it really highlights, you know, the racial and economic implications of, you know, of the whole system of financing, and how it's been left open for predatory entities like for-profit schools. So former students of for-profit schools like the defunct Corinthian colleges are in particular need of student loan relief and assistance. These are the clients that we see the most, and it's not just the former Corinthian schools. There are existing schools out there. There are many schools that shut down because of government enforcement actions, or they went bankrupt because their ability to get federal student loans was cut off due to their unlawful activity. But many of these students were lured in with false and misleading promises of high-paying jobs, and they ended up saddled with tens of thousands of dollars in student loan debt. A lot of it federal student loan, and some of it additionally private student loan debt, and none of the advertised outcomes that were promised by these schools. And unlike nonprofit and public schools, whose missions center on providing a quality education or research, for-profit schools are aimed at making a profit. And this business model often leads the schools to push students into expensive federal and private student loans to pay for an education that does not lead to employment in the field of study. Currently, there are over 1 million students enrolled in for-profit schools. And studies have shown that for-profit college students are less likely to graduate, more likely to default on their student loans, and more likely to end up with higher debt burdens. Indeed, half of all students attending for-profit colleges default on their student loans within 5 years of leaving the school. And in line with, with Kat Welbeck's comments, the for-profit sector preys on low-income and students of color, pushing them to take on student loan debt. That's their business model. They want to get the federal student loan money, and there's a limit on how much they can get. They're supposed to get, I think, only up to 90% of their funding can be federal to be eligible for federal financial aid funds. And so these schools often lure them or sign them up into predatory private student loans to make up the difference. African American and Latino students are overrepresented in for-profit colleges, and they often do not make it to graduation, but they're still saddled with thousands of dollars of student loan debt. Student debt traps low-income borrowers and exacerbates the systemic equities that already exist, as Kat well explained. Student loan debt is shown to disproportionately fuel the racial wealth gap as students of color take on more debt and are more likely to default. We have clients who are students of color, we have low-income clients, seniors, we have parents who took on Parent Plus loans for their children's education, and their student loan payments are so high, or they've entered into default and had their wages garnished or their Social Security benefits taken, or their tax refunds taken. And so they can't even afford to pay rent. They can't afford to buy a home. They can't get a car loan. They can't qualify for credit because of the damage to their credit scores. Some are afraid to get married and saddle their partner with debt. So you could see, this debt can have a real crippling effect on your life. And you will hear from a couple of our clients about their own experiences after me. As Kate noted, the federal government can collect by garnishing, wages and Social Security payments and tax refunds without even going to court. I mean, that's something they can do automatically when you take federal student loan debt out and then you default on it. For private student debt, just to note, that's treated like any other credit card debt or loan debt that you might have, and that typically requires them going to court, and that can be very harmful too, because a lot of people get sued and they can't afford legal representation. If they come to us, we try to help them with that, but they'll get sued and they may not respond, and there'll be a default judgment, and then that will lead to collection on the judgment through wage garnishment or bank levies, or even liens on private property. This situation only got worse during the Trump administration. Former Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos deregulated or engaged in an attempt to deregulate the for-profit sector. Part of that was repealing the requirement that career and certificate programs, many of which operate in the for-profit sector, prove their graduates could find gainful employment to maintain access to federal financial aid. So that was the gainful employment rule, and it was repealed by Secretary DeVos. That was important because if they couldn't show that their graduates could provide gainful employment, they couldn't keep their access to federal financial aid. And that was a way to make sure that for-profit schools were at least trying to provide a quality education. And then also they had to disclose comparisons of the student debt load of their graduates and their career earnings to other colleges. And that was part of the rule that was repealed. Now we're in a pandemic, and that's led to the expansion of online colleges, many of which are operated by for-profit schools. And these have their own unique disadvantages above and beyond the problems I've already noted with the for-profit schools. There is still a digital divide out there. Low-income students and families, many of which are people of color, do not have the same access to the internet, to Wi-Fi. If they do, their connections may not be as good. And that can impede the quality of an online education. Furthermore, you don't have the same kind of interaction with students and faculty that you would in in-person learning. And this can work to the disadvantage of students with little or no family or social background in higher education. I do see I might be coming up to my time, so I just want to close with just to note, you know, we at HERA do think that that providing relief from federal student loan repayment is something that should and can be done by the new administration, especially for low and moderate income borrowers who are struggling to make ends meet. And we also want to note that in an effort to help prospective college students avoid predatory schools and financing, HERA now offers a multilingual curriculum on choosing a college and paying for higher education. And those materials will be sent to participants of this press briefing. And that curriculum covers how California students can plan for how to pay for post-secondary education and how to shop for schools and financing while avoiding scams. And there is also material on how undocumented students in California can still apply for financial aid from the state, even though the federal government does not provide that at this time. And those are available on our website at heraca.org, and they're provided in English, Spanish, Korean, simplified Chinese, Tagalog, and Vietnamese. And we are available. I think one thing to note is, as Kat noted, there are companies out there that will scam you and say they can get rid of your private student loan debt or your federal student loan debt. You shouldn't have to pay for that help. Legal aid organizations are available to do that. My organization, HERA, has attorneys that can counsel student loan borrowers in California on their repayment and potential discharge options. So I'll close now, as I think I'm over time. And if there's time for questions, I'm happy to take them, or I'm happy to let our students speak at this point.
Okay, great. Thank you, Joe. You know, one of the things that has been talked about, and when President Biden did his town hall, I think it was on one of the major networks, he was asked the question about the 50,000. You know, will you forgive 50,000? And he said, no, I will forgive 10,000 and find other ways to make college more affordable. There are studies that indicate that most of the low-income folks have the lower debt, and that people who owe 50,000 are not the low-income people. And that's why apparently he's made up his mind not to do the 50,000. So what's your argument on this?
So, you know, I'm coming at this from an advocate for student loan borrowers and what we see on the ground. And what we see here on the ground in California is thousands of students and former students saddled with debt, most of whom in our experience are low income, many of whom are people of color or seniors. And so, you know, I think as the Congressman noted, and as Kat Welbeck noted, I mean, this would go a long way to help that segment of the population, the most disadvantaged, you know, move ahead in with their financial well-being. And so I think it's too easy to just say that it doesn't, you know, it would you know, it would mainly benefit people who don't need as much help. I think you know, there may be ways to target it based on income, as the Congressman noted. So, you know, we definitely think that this has to be looked at more closely. It can't just be dismissed, and it can't be limited to just a $10,000 forgiveness, because that, for many people, you know, most people coming out of a for-profit school carry about 30,000 in private student loans, and they can't find a job in their field of study, and they can't, they're definitely not earning what they were told they would earn after the program. So we think definitely more needs to be done.
A question from Henrietta Burrows. Do you want to ask your question, Henrietta?
Yes, thank you, Pilar. You mentioned, Joe, that undocumented students in California can apply for financial aid from the state. what protections do they have being undocumented? Wouldn't some of them fear that they're taking a risk for being deported if they apply?
So the application is done solely through the state of California, higher education agency, and it's the California DREAM Act is state law, and it does maintain the confidentiality of the applicant to the extent necessary. It's not shared with the federal government. And so I've not heard of any problems of undocumented students who apply for state financial aid assistance, which includes Cal grants, of being reported to the federal government.
Would these students have to be enrolled in DACA? Is there any regulations, requirements in terms of that?
There are very specific requirements, and they can be found on the name of the agency escapes me, but I believe it's the California. I'm gonna look it up here just to be sure, because I think it's important.
You can look it up and put it in the chat at some point.
Yeah, I'll do it that way. But there are specific requirements. I don't think DACA is a prerequisite. I think people that are not in DACA may still have a way to qualify.
Okay. So you are in California, but how can people identify organizations like yours in other states, Joe?
So if they contacted us, we could definitely locate a similar agency in their state. There are legal aid organizations all over the country in every state. And so that's usually your first choice. You do have to qualify for legal aid assistance, though. They do not generally provide to undocumented students, and they do not, it's based on income as well. But sometimes they usually can locate an agency that doesn't have those restrictions. My organization in California does not have that restriction. We're not Legal Services Corporation funded, and there are similar organizations across the country. There is also at the Harvard Law School has the Project on Predatory Student Loans. And so they're kind of, they do a lot of advocacy and litigation, but they can also be a clearinghouse to help people, get assistance in their local area. So you can contact us, or you can look up the Project for Predatory Student Loans lending at the Harvard Law School.
Great, thank you, Joe. And we'll be sending all the materials that Joe and Kat sent us to you all after the call. But we want to hear from two people that came to Joe's organization for help, and they can tell us their story. First, we're going to hear from Andrea Campo. Andrea, are you there? I know you are.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Andrea. So first, tell us a little bit about you, what school you went to, and what you're doing now.
Okay, well, once again, my name is Andrea Campos. I attended Heald College, which was a part of the Corinthians schools, and I was majoring in the criminal justice program.
Where was this? In what area of California?
Heald College. The school was located out of Hayward, and it's one of the Corinthian colleges.
Okay, so how has the student loan debt impacted your life, and how much debt did you have?
I had over $13,000 in student debt. It impacted my life significantly. As mentioned earlier by somebody, I was actually denied a position to a job. I took a free bank training course, and I was then hired, about to be in prospect of being hired, but I was denied the opportunity because my debt to income ratio was too high, and I was looked at as an at-risk type of employee. So I was denied a position, and I've also haven't been able to, be approved for loans, for credit cards, car loans, especially with the housing. It makes it very impossible to be approved because of my credit score and the impact it has on that.
So So you went to Joe's organization, but what was your situation? Did you default or what was your issue?
Yes, I ended up defaulting during my time at Heald College. I was nearly done. I had to take a semester off due to a family emergency. And when I was set to come back to school, the school was actually in process of getting shut down. So it was very difficult for me to navigate, what to do with the loans. How do I, take care of this because the school shut down. I didn't have information. I kept receiving something, a paper to fill out that said, if you don't keep your credits, you're able to kind of have this loan forgiven. But if you decide to keep your credits, that you will be, still billed for it. And I was never able, my loans kept going from one creditor to another. And it seems like every year or so, I would fill out a form that I stated, I will not keep my transcript. I released my transcript to you guys. And it just was very hard. It was very complicated navigation to get through a loan.
So were you able to pay some of it, or did it keep going up?
Well, as the school kind of the agreement of the form, the agreement would be that if I release my transcript, that I did not have to pay. But every year it seemed like that was just more of a deferment, and I ended up getting to deferment and not paying. And I was confused as to why, because based on the documentation I received, I thought I signed something that said, okay, I release my transcript, I release all of that. So it was definitely a big miscommunication, and there was no one directly to speak to, because then the people who were contacting me were just the creditors who had no knowledge about this agreement, who were just there to, charge me by the month. And I just ended up always filling out something that just put me on a deferment, but I didn't know what that meant. Mm-hmm. I didn't know essentially that I would have to pay that back. And it was just a temporary hold on my loan.
So what is something you wish you knew before taking out these loans?
I feel like I was really deceived by the recruiters. I'm a first generation college student. I was actually raised by my grandparents. So navigating the system at 19 years old was very misleading for me. I thought that, in order to be successful, in order to have a prosperous future, I shouldn't have put a limit on financial burden of education. But I come to find out later that, those numbers really, they weren't a realistic thing based off what job I was able to get, which was none in the career that I was going for. And that was really hard for me.
There's a question from Sunita in the chat. What kind of interest were you charged, Andrea? Do you remember?
I'm not sure of the exact number, but even if I did know, at 19 at that time, I don't think I even knew what that meant. I was not even aware of what's a high interest and versus what's, something affordable. I had no knowledge on that.
Okay, and how did HERA help you?
HERA was able, they helped me a lot. Being a part of being denied from that job that I mentioned earlier, it led me to a resource to HERA, so it was really a growing opportunity for me. And they helped me actually get the whole thing forgiven, because I qualified under some type of act that the borrower's defense, because the school shut down while I was, in progress of attending. And I qualified that if the school shut down and you were attending within a certain time period, you could potentially qualify for this forgiveness. And it was still a difficult process because of how tricky the system makes it. It looked like I even attended 2 different schools at once, which wasn't true. And they made it very difficult to kind of have students go through the process of forgiveness. Like, I would not have been able to do this alone. I tried to do it alone and I kept getting put off, just wait, just wait. And if it wasn't for HERA, I would have never been able to actually get to the bottom of this.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for your time and being with us today. I'm going to go to Gabriel Stewart and ask similar questions from him. Gabriel, thank you.
Hi, thanks.
Hi,
you guys for
Gabriel, how are
having me.
you?
I'm doing well.
Tell me about, what student did you go to, what college did you go to, and what you're doing right now?
So I attended Expressions College in San Jose in 2013, and I graduated in 2015. And now I work for VMware in Palo Alto as an audiovisual technician.
Okay, and how much student debt did you have?
So by myself, I have about 52,000.
Wow, 52.
52, yeah.
Okay, and so how did that, okay, that sounds like a lot. So how did that shape your life? How did that affect you?
Well, after I graduated, I got married, and my wife as well had student loan debt, so it added on to that. And we had to move in with my dad. Wasn't able to, basically I couldn't pay rent anywhere, just because on top of student loans, I had credit card debts, and it just really made it difficult for us to really just feel like we could really start a family and be free. And we eventually had a son, and all of our money was basically going to paying off our debts. We basically just had to live in a room for about 5 years, and we recently just moved out, so I'm very happy about that. And but yeah, it seemed like all of our money, even really because of the pandemic, a lot of things options have been given to kind of slow down our payments, but it's always that looming feeling of, okay, when the payments start again, how are we going to be able to afford this again? So it's really just prevented me from getting things like a car, buying a house, or just renting a house, getting loans for certain things, and just really just having a sense of really being free, always feeling like there's something that we won't be able to buy because we need that to pay off this debt. So it's just a constant stress in the back of my head.
So how have you been helped? Have you been, able to resolve some of this at all?
I haven't been able, I've only been paying the minimum payments, which has only been really the interest since I graduated, and the principal has just been getting bigger and bigger. Same thing for my wife. She's only been able to pay. I'm the only one working right now, so I'm basically paying for her as well. So yeah, it's gone up. It hasn't gone down since then.
Do you feel that there's some kind of stigma attached to college debt, that you feel like, this is somehow a failure, or?
Yeah, I really felt like I was led almost like a pipe dream. When I was getting recruited into the school, they said, we don't have any financial aid or scholarships available, but if you take out the debt, the loan, you'll get a high-paying job. You'll be able to pay it off in a reasonable amount of time. We'll guarantee that you find something that's suitable for the payments, and none of that happened. It was almost like they just needed to say that just to get me in the door so they can get the money. But as soon as I graduated, just communication started getting slower. Yeah, it didn't seem fair.
You did not get a high-paying job, is that what you're saying?
I did not get a high-paying job, no. I had to work multiple jobs after I graduated, just to keep the payments going, because our goal was we didn't want our credit to get affected because we wanted to buy a house. So we paid on time every time, but that came with a cost, a sacrifice of what we were able to do. So we were living just to pay debt.
Gabriel, thank you for your testimony. This is so painful to listen to. But I appreciate you coming here and telling that story. It can't be easy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate you guys.
I want to ask all our speakers that are still on, Kat and Joe. Well, Kat, what would you want Joe Biden, the president, to do? What would you want Congress and the president to do to address this?
I don't know if I'm speaking in my personal or professional capacity, but I mean, I will, at least in my personal capacity, I think Joe said this earlier, but I am definitely, pro more cancellation. I think if there's anything that we've heard here today, it's just like very clear that, this crisis is just holding, so many student loan borrowers back, and for many, there was a bait and switch. There are also, predatory institutions that are like actively, targeting communities. And so I think, to the extent that we're saying we're committed to equity, we're committed to improving, this economy and making things more just. I think, seeking a way to actually push for cancellation is just something that's really important here. And I also just want to thank both Gabriel and Andrea for sharing your stories. Those are just so powerful, and so really grateful to you both for talking about your experiences.
Thank you, Kat. Joe, what can people like Andrea and Gabriel do? I mean, and also a double question: are state schools making life hard for students as well as the for-profit ones?
Okay, I mean, so at HERA, we try to address, we try to look at each student's, student debt load and everything else that's going on, the school they went to and what happened, what promises were made, what did they actually get. And there are different discharge programs available. Not all of them work as well as the others. Certain schools that have closed down while someone was in the middle of attending the school, people who took out student loans in that situation may be eligible for a closed school discharge of their federal student loans. Andrea mentioned the Borrower Defense to Repayment Discharge Program. That is one that is in litigation right now, and we are co-counsel with the Project for Predatory Student Lending, suing the Department of Education because at least under the Trump administration, they really slowed down and got in a backlog of like hundreds of thousands of applications. But that program is basically where it's this exact situation that Gabriel and Andrea encountered. They were promised a high-paying job to make certain salary in their field of study. They were lured in to take student loans because that was the business model, and they were not offered grants or scholarships, and they took out federal and maybe private student loans and did not get what was promised. And that's the exact situation where the Borrower Defense to Repayment discharge should apply. And Andrea was able to benefit from that. It sounds like Gabe wasn't. Gabriel, I haven't worked with him specifically. I think one of our other attorneys has, but we'll continue to look at his situation. It could be that he's. I won't get into more details on that, but there's a whole class of hundreds of thousands of borrowers right now who are kind of in limbo because their applications either have not been processed or they've been summarily denied without explanation or evidence by the Department of Education under Secretary DeVos. And so that's one thing we're challenging in court. Just briefly, there are also other discharge programs. If you are permanently and totally disabled, you may be entitled to a discharge of your federal student loans. If you go into a qualified public service full-time employment and make student loan payments for 10 years on your federal student loans with certification by your employer, theoretically, you should be entitled to public service loan forgiveness. There's been a lot of problems with that program, very few applications granted. We're hopeful that the new administration will administer it properly and improve it. It's just, there's so many things that need to be done for people to qualify for that, and it was not explained clearly, or there were problems in tracking their qualified payments. So these are some of the options. And then in terms of, are there similar problems with state schools? Not as many. You know, sometimes problems happen with state schools. Now that the state schools are getting into online education, we may see some issues with that. You know, I don't want to give them a clean slate, but the clients we see more are those from the for-profit schools, and that's why we really want to urge people to avoid them, to look into alternatives. Even community college first, public schools and other nonprofit schools are generally not going to give you these kind of problems.
We have run out of time. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass it to Sandy Close now to say goodbye.
I don't want to say goodbye. I want to ask more questions. Thank you so much. One last final question to the students. Could you have gone to college without borrowing the funds? And what are your thoughts about the drop in enrollment across the board? How much do you think it's fear other students have of not getting trapped the way you did?
Andrea or Gabriel?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I missed the first part, but the second part, for sure, I think a lot of students don't want to go because they're learning just how much debt is destroying, you know, other people's lives. And I mean, I have friends who didn't go to school, and, you know, I tell them my situation, they're like, oh, I'm glad I didn't do that, you know, make that decision. And it's changing society a lot.
Thank you. And
Andrea, do you want to add anything?
For me, like I mentioned, I'm a first generation college student, actually even a high school graduate as well. So for me, going to college was really important. I did not know how to navigate through the community college system alone. And, you know, when I seen this commercial, you know, promoting that you're going to get in, you're going to get out and fast and ahead, you know, in a short period of time, that really caught my attention because, you know, I'm like, how can I move myself further in life, you know, at a rapid rate and be able to help my family? And, you know, that's really what was the misleading part, that, you know, that thinking that you're going to do something fast and it's going to be a fast paced thing and boom, 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 it's really what trapped me. You know, the fast way was the harder way. And just not knowing enough about college, community college, you know, being sold from this for-profit, you know, immediately because it sounded good, it was packaged well, you know, and just not knowing about the options at community college. I now attend community college, and I definitely recommend for, you know, people out there, you know, look into your local community colleges because there's financial aid, there's grants, there's scholarships, there's a lot more assistance at community college that students can navigate through.
okay, thank you. I know we have to stop, but I want to say all our speakers really provided an eye-opening picture that student debt is pulling a whole generation down, and that we just can't afford to lose people in this spiral of student debt. Thank you very, very much. Very eye-opening. Thank you, Pilar.